This is your setup video for the flipped classroom session we're going to have on an age of excess, about the understudied Gilded Age from 1877 to 1900. Now, the thing that we have to focus on here is the fact that we study history in terms of blocks of time called periods. And the period 1877 to 1900 is our first period after Reconstruction. Reconstruction was another period that we study. And this is a way for historians to get a handle on a huge part of history, which we call the second half of U.S. history. They break it down into periods. Now, in the case of the Gilded Age, what we want to do is we want to figure out the ways in which the Gilded Age was a unique period, different than any other period, but we also want to understand how it relates to today. In other words, how today is similar to, as well as different from, the Gilded Age. And that is what we're going to try to analyze in our flipped classroom session. Now, as you can see here, the age has a number of characteristics. The age of excess, overproduction of goods, oversupply of labor. You can't really say that about other periods of time. But what happens as a result of these things is inflation and deflation, falling prices. Now, also what was unique about the period is that it follows the Civil War, which made Americans insensitive to suffering. And for a variety of reasons, it was a time of growing racism. Americans were tired of the Civil War era, which had resulted in an attention that had never been devoted before to black rights. And America was tired of reform by 1877. So this type of turning away from reform and intensifying racism is another characteristic of the age of excess. So too was the idea of organizing for conflict, groups trying to wage war on other groups, if not by violence, then through the law. And at the same time, you have at the very end of this slide some attention to the fact that government was unresponsive to all these problems. So, what we want to try to figure out is whether the Gilded Age was like the present or not like the present. And of course, like most periods in history, it has some similarities as well as differences. We don't experience deflation, we experience inflation, although that's quite low right now. On the other hand, we do have a government that seems unresponsive to the needs of the people. And so, in that sense, the Gilded Age looks similar. Now, what you're going to have to do in our flipped classroom session is find other connections between the Gilded Age and the present. And what makes this particularly interesting is the fact that the Gilded Age is considered one of the worst periods in American history. A period of rising racism, after all. A period of insensitivity to suffering. A period of conflict in which government was not a fair umpire, but sided with the rich against the poor. If the Gilded Age was like our time, then so much more the pity for us. Woe is us. But we need to look at the facts. We need to look at the facts straight in the eye, and we need to recognize them if that in fact is true. So this slideshow, as you can see, talks about some aspects of the Gilded Age, and again, don't ignore the fact that periods of time have their own personality, and there is no such thing as a period of time that repeats itself. So the present day today cannot possibly be exactly like the Gilded Age, and I want you to tell me how it was like and unlike the present. Now, here again, we see the problem in threefold. We have to understand what Jeffersonian and Hamiltonianism and social Darwinism are. We have to look at the organizations for conflict. They were the trusts. Those were the monopolies of their day. The grangers, those were farmers who organized to regulate railroad rates. There was also laws that regulated and dispossessed the Indians of their land. And there were these American Protective Association and Immigration Restriction League organizations that were directly against the immigrants. Well, you can say, well, we have people who don't like immigrants today. So there is a similarity. However, you have to understand what these organizations were like to say whether they were indeed similar. These slides provide quotations about the Indian policy of the government, represented by the Dawes Act. And here are primary sources that can be looked at to see what attitudes prevailed in regards to the Dawes Act. This slide deals with the 1890s, and this slide specifically questions what happened in the 1890s, which was a decade of reform, ironically. It was the last decade of the Gilded Age, but it was a decade of growing reform, which contradicts the theme that I've talked about with respect to the Gilded Age. But it was a time of failed reform. The populist movement was an attempt at reform, and I want you to diagnose this movement. I want you to try to figure out what its strengths and weaknesses were, and what it was trying to achieve, and why it failed. The last slides in this show talk about the changes that took place during the Gilded Age. In all these variables, coal, railroad track mileage, value of manufacturing exports, property values, and the population of the cities relative to the country, and patents, all these things represent a huge expansion and growth. We can't say that we have similar growth today. Look at these statistics. They're awesome. Railroad track mileage. The United States had more railroad track mileage by 1900 than in all of Europe. Value of manufacturing exports. By 1914, the United States was poised to become the richest nation in the world. Property values rose steadily, but property was not widely distributed. It was concentrated in the hands of the very, very few. And we see this trend taking place today, where the very few, we call them the 1%, seems to control and own all of the wealth. Today, of course, we have a much more urban population, but by 1900, 40% of the country was urban, and we'll look at the definition of that. It was a time of inventions, and you can look at the explosion of patents, which were legal documents that people filed when they made an invention. In the first 15 years of the 20th century, there were as many patents filed as in the last 35 years of the 19th century. And these are examples of the organizations for conflict. I talked about the immigration restriction organizations, but we also have the trusts, the Populist Party to some extent. And this tends to fit the idea that America was becoming, or ought to be, a homogeneous national entity where there was as little diversity as possible. What is our attitude towards diversity? Are we supportive of diversity today? To the extent that we are not like the Gilded Age. To the extent that we are not, we are like the Gilded Age. So what I want you to do is to look at specific aspects of the Gilded Age and be prepared in our flipped classroom session to talk about some specific aspect of the Gilded Age relative to today. It might be the trusts. It might be the Immigration Restriction League. It might be the Dawes Act. But I want you to pick out one aspect of the Gilded Age that you discover from your textbook or this slideshow and talk about how it was similar to and different from America today. That's your assignment.